39 seconds. That's the gap seismologists keep coming back to when they talk about what happened in northern Venezuela on the 24th of June. A magnitude 7.2 earthquake ruptured the ground southeast of a town called Umare. And while that rupture was still traveling, before anybody in Caracas had finished forming the thought that was an earthquake, a second one hit. Magnitude 7.5. 39 seconds after the first. Two different faults, two separate ruptures, and no pause between them, which is why survivors describe it as one event that simply refused to stop. 8 weeks later, Colombia. 5 days after Colombia, Indonesia. 3 earthquakes at magnitude 7 or greater inside 8 weeks, every one of them in a place where millions of people sleep at night. You've probably already seen what the internet did with that. Within hours of the Indonesian quake, there were videos telling you the planet has entered a new phase, that the plates are accelerating, that this is the beginning of something. I want to walk you through all 3 of these events in detail, because they deserve detail. And then I want to give you the honest answer to the question everybody's asking, which is whether they're connected. The answer is going to surprise you in a direction you're not expecting. It isn't the comforting one and it isn't the doomsday one. It's the third thing. If you want the version of these stories where somebody actually reads the science before talking, subscribing takes 2 seconds and this channel does it every single time. Let's start where the bodies are. Northern Venezuela sits on one of the more awkward pieces of tectonic real estate on Earth. The Caribbean plate is sliding eastward past the South American plate, and instead of doing that along one clean line, the motion is smeared across a wide belt of faults known as the Bocano, San Sebastián, and El Pilar system. That system runs for more than 1,300 kilometers from the Venezuelan Andes out toward Trinidad. If you want a sense of that length, it's roughly the drive from Chicago to New York City, and it's all one interconnected fault family. Here's the part that matters. Those 2 plates are moving past each other at about 2 centimeters a year. That's roughly what your hair grows in 7 weeks. It sounds trivial. It is not trivial because the fault is locked, and locked means the plates keep moving while the rock at the boundary refuses to. Think of it as a debt. Every year, the boundary borrows 2 more centimeters of movement it hasn't paid for. Nothing visible happens. The balance just climbs silently for a century or more until the rock can no longer carry it and the whole account settles in a single violent payment. On the 24th of June, at 4 minutes past 6 in the evening local time, the bill came due on the Bocano strand, magnitude 7.2, at a depth of about 20 kilometers. And that first rupture appears to have pushed the neighboring San Sebastián fault past its own limit, because 39 seconds later it broke too, at magnitude 7.5, shallower at about 10 kilometers down, with the rupture running east along the coast. 10 kilometers is not deep. That's roughly the cruising altitude of a passenger jet turned upside down and driven into the ground beneath a coastline where people live. Shallow earthquakes concentrate their energy in a small area near the surface instead of spreading it out, and that's why this one was so brutal. What Venezuela experienced has a name. Seismologists call it a doublet, and it means 2 earthquakes of comparable size, close together in space and time, where the second one isn't really an aftershock because it's too big and it's on its own fault. They're uncommon. Most large earthquakes are followed by a decaying sequence of smaller ones, each releasing a fraction of the parent's energy. A doublet breaks that pattern entirely, and it produces a specific kind of destruction that ordinary sequences don't. Here's why. Buildings under seismic loading don't fail instantly. They fail progressively. Columns crack, connections loosen, walls separate from frames, and a structure that survives the first shaking is often carrying damage that has cut its remaining capacity in half. Standard building codes assume you get a gap after that. Time to evacuate. Time for the structure to stop moving. Venezuela got 39 seconds. Buildings that had just been weakened by a magnitude 7.2 were hit by a magnitude 7.5 before anyone inside them had reached a stairwell. And this coastline has done this before. The Caracas earthquake of 1812, which devastated the city, is thought by researchers to have involved two separate sub-events, one on the Boconó Fault and one on the western San Sebastián. In 1900, an earthquake now known as San Narciso struck along the San Sebastián Fault east of Caracas. Until June of this year, that 1900 event was the strongest Venezuela had recorded. This system has a habit, and the habit is documented. The state of La Guaira, on the coast just north of Caracas, took the worst of it. Reporting from the region indicated that around 80% of buildings there collapsed. Not damaged, collapsed. In the capital itself, buildings came down in neighborhoods that weren't even in the zone of strongest shaking, which tells you something uncomfortable about the building stock rather than about the earthquake. The numbers that followed were the slowest and most painful I've watched accumulate in years of reading these event pages. The government's first figure, on the 25th of June, was 157. Within days, it was in the hundreds. By the 1st of July, officials were confirming more than 2,200. By early July, Britannica's account of the disaster cited government reporting of more than 3,800 confirmed dead, more than 16,700 injured, and more than 40,000 people missing. As of August, the toll being reported stood above 6,300 dead, with roughly 73,000 people hospitalized and tens of thousands still unaccounted for. The United States Geological Survey's Rapid Assessment System, which estimates casualties from shaking intensity and building vulnerability before anybody on the ground can count, issued a red alert for both quakes and warned the final total could pass 10,000. Red is the highest level that system issues. It was right to be that loud. It's worth pausing on why those figures climb the way they do, because it gets misread constantly. A rising death toll does not mean the earthquake is somehow still happening. It means the counting is catching up with something that finished in 90 seconds. Confirmed dead is a number that requires a body, a name, and a record, and every one of those takes time in a collapsed city. Missing is a different number entirely, and it overlaps with the dead in ways nobody can resolve for months. Some of the missing are under rubble. Some are in a hospital across town with no phone. Some walk to a relative's house in another state and have no way to tell anyone. Treating a missing figure as a death figure is one of the most common errors in disaster coverage, and it's why you'll see wildly different totals from equally serious sources reporting on the same week. The truthful thing to say is that the real toll in Venezuela is somewhere above the confirmed count and below the confirmed plus missing, and that it will be years before anyone knows where. And there's a detail buried in this that explains part of why the count moved so slowly. Venezuela has one of the most restricted information environments in the world. In the days after the quake, more than 200 websites were blocked inside the country, including news outlets and the tools people use to get around blocks. Families abroad couldn't find out whether their relatives were alive. The United Nations publicly urged the government to restore access on the grounds that in the hours after a disaster, information is not a luxury, it's a survival tool. Rescue teams work faster when they know where to dig. Now move west and forward 8 weeks. Monday, the 10th of August, 34 minutes past 7 in the morning. Colombia's Pacific Department of Choco, near a town called San Jose del Palmar, magnitude 7.4. The Colombian Geological Service called it the strongest earthquake recorded in the country this century, and initially measured it at 6.6 before revising upward, which tells you how fast and how confusing those first minutes are, even for professionals. But here's the thing about the Colombian earthquake that almost nobody covering it mentioned, and it's the single most important fact in this entire video. It happened at a depth of about 110 kilometers. Stop and picture that. 110 kilometers straight down is roughly the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego, except pointed at the center of the Earth. That is not a normal earthquake depth. That is deep inside the slab of oceanic crust that's been sliding beneath South America for millions of years. Off Colombia's west coast, the Nazca plate is diving under the continent. As it descends, it bends, and it heats, and it gets pulled by its own weight, and the rock inside it fractures under stresses that have nothing to do with the surface. The USGS described this event as primarily strike slip, faulting at around 110 kilometers depth in the northernmost part of the South American subduction zone, where these intermediate depth earthquakes occur at all. And that raises a question that took geologists most of the 20th century to answer, which is how an earthquake happens down there at all. At 110 kilometers, the pressure is crushing and the temperature is high enough that rock should deform slowly, like warm wax, rather than snapping. Rock that flows doesn't produce earthquakes, it just moves. The answer is that the descending slab is cold. It spent tens of millions of years sitting on the seafloor before it started its dive, and it carries that chill down with it faster than the surrounding mantle can warm it through. So you get a rigid, brittle sheet of old ocean floor plunging into hot plastic rock, bending as it goes, and tearing along faults inside itself under forces generated by its own weight pulling it downward. The USGS notes that these intermediate depth earthquakes are common along the whole length of the South American subduction zone, and that they're usually put down to exactly those bending forces inside the slab. What made the August event unusual is where it sat. It occurred near the northernmost limit of where intermediate depth earthquakes occur in this zone at all, in a region that has historically produced quakes below magnitude 7. Since 1950, only 2 events of magnitude 7 or larger have been recorded within 250 kilometers of it, and both of those were near the coast rather than inland and deep. Deep earthquakes behave differently from shallow ones. Because the energy has so much rock to travel through, the shaking directly above tends to be less violent than a shallow quake of the same size, but it spreads across a much wider area. That's exactly what happened. Around 10.5 million people experienced strong to very strong shaking. It was felt in Bogotá, roughly 240 kilometers away, and across the borders into Ecuador and Panama. The damage told the story of a country built on hills. In Cali, buildings came down, including sections of a hospital that housed the pediatric and neonatal wards. In Pereira, passengers were trapped inside cable car cabins suspended above the city and had to be brought down one by one, an operation that took until roughly 1:30 in the afternoon. Manizales suspended its cable car system too. Airports across the coffee region shut down. Quindío reported more than 10,000 homes affected. The confirmed death toll climbed the way these tolls always climb. The president's early figure was 111. By that evening, 132 dead and 570 injured were being reported. Later reporting put the figure above 220. Chocó, where the epicenter sat, is one of Colombia's poorest regions. Dense jungle, much of it reachable only by boat or plane, which meant the full picture took days to assemble. 5 days later, on the other side of the planet. Saturday the 15th of August, 58 minutes past 5 in the morning, off the northern coast of Flores Island in eastern Indonesia. Magnitude 7.7 at a depth of about 10 kilometers, with the epicenter roughly 68 kilometers north-northwest of the city of Ende. That's the largest of the 3, and by a wider margin than the numbers suggest. Magnitude is logarithmic, and each step up releases dramatically more energy. Magnitude 7.7 released somewhere close to twice the energy of the Colombian 7.4, and it did it at 1/11th of the depth. Shallow, offshore, and large is the combination that produces tsunamis. To understand why, you have to understand what a tsunami is and what it isn't. It isn't water that gets pushed sideways by shaking, it's water that gets lifted. When a shallow offshore earthquake displaces the seafloor vertically, it raises or drops the entire column of ocean sitting on top of it, and that displacement spreads outward as a wave, with a wavelength that can stretch for 100 kilometers. In deep water, it's almost invisible. A ship might not notice it passing underneath. It only becomes a wall when it reaches shallow water, and the front of the wave slows down while the back of it keeps coming, stacking the whole thing upward. Flores sits in the Banda Arc, one of the most tectonically complicated places on the planet, where the Australian plate is driving northward into Southeast Asia, and the crust in between is being crumpled, stacked, and rotated in ways geologists are still arguing about. Shallow, offshore, and large is the exact combination that region specializes in, and everybody who lives there knows it. Indonesia's meteorological agency issued a tsunami warning within minutes and told coastal residents to get away from beaches and riverbanks and climb. Video obtained by the Associated Press later showed a coastal village called Nagata blanketed in mud and debris after a wave measured at 1.6 meters came ashore. That's about 5 feet 3 inches of moving water carrying sediment and boats inland. Fishing vessels were left stranded on dry ground when it pulled back. The warning was lifted a few hours later once monitoring showed no further threat. More than 230 aftershocks shook Flores through the day, the strongest of them magnitude 6.2. Landslides blocked the roads into Nagakeo, the district nearest the epicenter, which meant rescue teams couldn't reach the place most likely to be worst hit. In the port town of Malmare, crews found 20 dead in the rubble on the first day. A resident of Talabura village told Reuters there were 13 people inside her house, and every one of them ran. By Sunday, the 16th, rescuers had recovered 4 more bodies, and the confirmed toll stood at 51, with thousands displaced. Hospitals evacuated patients into open ground, moving beds and oxygen cylinders outside and treating people in the car parks. And this is the same stretch of coastline that was struck in December of 1992 when an earthquake and the tsunami it generated killed more than 2,500 people on Flores. The island has a long memory for this. So, 3 events, more than 6,500 people dead between them, 8 weeks. Before I answer the connection question, I'm curious about something. If you've ever felt an earthquake, tell me in the comments where you were and what the first second felt like, because almost everyone describes that first second differently, and I find it fascinating. Sound, or motion, or the strange one where people say they felt it in their stomach first. Right. Are they connected? Go back to the debt. Every fault has its own account, and here's what the 3 accounts look like. Venezuela's earthquakes happened where the Caribbean plate slides horizontally past South America. Right lateral strike slip. The rock on the far side moves to the right. No plate going under another one, no subduction, just 2 enormous blocks grinding past each other at about 2 centimeters a year, 10 to 20 kilometers beneath the surface. Colombia's earthquake happened 110 kilometers underground, inside a slab of ocean floor that has already been swallowed. The Nazca plate isn't sliding past South America there. It's going under it, and the fracture that produced this quake came from the slab bending and tearing under its own descent. That's a completely different process, at a completely different depth, on a completely different plate boundary. The engine driving Venezuela's quakes is not the engine that drove Colombia's, even though the 2 countries share a border. I want to be clear about that, because I've seen it stated the other way around more than once in the last week, including by people who should check first. 2 South American earthquakes in 8 weeks is not 2 earthquakes on one system. Indonesia's earthquake was a third mechanism again, shallow, offshore, in the Banda Arc, where the crust is being compressed and stacked as Australia's plate drives north into Asia, 15,000 kilometers from the other 2. 3 mechanisms, 3 plate boundaries, 2 hemispheres. There is no physical pathway by which a slab tearing beneath the Andes tells a fault north of Flores what to do. Now the statistics, and this is where the whole narrative falls apart. Since about 1900, the long-term global average is roughly 15 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater every single year, 1 every 3.5 weeks, on average, somewhere on Earth. 3 in 8 weeks isn't unusual. 3 in 8 weeks is very slightly ahead of schedule. And we can check the year directly. As of the 10th of August, when Colombia happened, 10 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had been recorded worldwide in 2026. Indonesia's made 11. By the middle of August, the expected number on the long-term average is about 9 or 10. So the year is running marginally above average, and marginally above average is what most years do in one direction or the other. 2010 produced 23 of them. 1989 produced 6. The number bounces. Run the arithmetic yourself, and it stops feeling like a coincidence at all. 15 events a year, spread over 52 weeks, means the expected number inside any 8-week window is a little over 2. 2.3 to be precise. So the question isn't why we got 3. The question is why anybody expected to get 2.3 when the planet has never once delivered a fractional earthquake and never will. Random events don't arrive on a schedule. They arrive in bunches, with gaps in between. And the bunches are not evidence of anything. If you scattered 15 dots at random across a calendar year, you would find clumps in it every single time you tried. You'd find 3 dots in a fortnight somewhere. You'd also find 6-week stretches with nothing at all, and nobody makes videos about those. There is no channel on this platform titled 6 weeks and not a single Magnitude-7. What are the plates hiding? That asymmetry is the whole illusion. Our brains are pattern detection machines that were built for a world where noticing 3 of anything in a row usually meant something, and they are extremely bad at recognizing that randomness looks lumpy. Give a person a genuinely random sequence and they'll call it clustered. Give them an evenly spaced sequence and they'll call it random. It's one of the most reliable findings in the whole of behavioral psychology, and it's the engine behind every seismic uptick video you've ever been recommended. The reason it feels different is not seismic, it's editorial and it's demographic. Malaysia in February, Tonga and Vanuatu in March, Japan and Indonesia in April, the Philippines in June with a magnitude 7.8 south of Mindanao. Most of those you never heard about. They struck offshore or under sparsely populated ground, and the news cycle moved on inside a day. The 3 we're discussing landed on cities, which brings me to the part that is worth being alarmed about, because there is one. The seismicity is normal, the consequences are not, and they're getting worse for reasons that have nothing to do with the plates. More people live in seismic zones than at any point in human history, and a growing share of them live in mid-rise concrete buildings put up quickly, in economies where enforcement of building codes competes with the immediate need for somewhere to live. Around 80% of Venezuela's population lives in earthquake-prone territory, much of it in housing never engineered to resist shaking, in a country where decades of economic contraction deferred maintenance across the entire built environment. That's why a magnitude 7.5 killed thousands in La Guaira, while comparably sized earthquakes elsewhere in the world killed dozens. The ground shook about as hard as it does in a lot of places. The buildings answered differently. The honest sentence is this: Earth is not producing more earthquakes. Humanity has moved more of itself into the path of the ones it always produced, and built much of that housing out of materials that fail catastrophically instead of bending. Every one of those 3 tolls is a construction story wearing a geology costume, which also means the useful response to all of this is not fear, it's specificity. If you live somewhere seismic, and roughly a fifth of humanity does, the questions that matter are boring and local. What decade was your building put up, and what code was in force then? Whether the heavy furniture in the room where you sleep is fixed to a wall or standing free, whether anyone in your household knows where the water shutoff is, whether you have any water stored at all, because in every one of these 3 disasters, the immediate crisis after the shaking stopped was not rescue, it was drinking water. None of that is dramatic, and all of it works. In La Guaira, in Cali, in Momir, the difference between people who walked out and people who didn't was almost never a difference in how big the earthquake was. It was what they were standing inside when it arrived. Now, one caveat, because I promised you the 3rd answer and not the comfortable one. Earthquakes can influence other earthquakes. That's real physics, not speculation. When a fault ruptures, it redistributes stress into the surrounding crust, loading some nearby faults and unloading others. That's called static stress transfer, and it's exactly what appears to have happened in Venezuela when the first rupture pushed its neighbor past breaking point inside 39 seconds. But static stress transfer operates over tens of kilometers, not thousands, not continents. Nothing about Venezuela in June changed the stress state of a slab beneath Colombia or a fault north of Flores by any amount a seismometer could distinguish from zero. Which is where this story stops being a roundup and becomes something more specific, because the stress that did move went somewhere, and researchers have modeled where. In July, a team writing for Temblor published Coulomb's stress modeling of the June 24th doublet, using the rupture solution the USGS calculated. The question they asked was straightforward. The Venezuelan quakes released an enormous amount of accumulated strain on one section of the San Sebastián system, but ruptures don't clear the whole balance. They transfer part of it to the adjacent segments, the same way settling one account can leave you owing more on the next. East of Umare, the next segment of the San Sebastián fault runs beneath the Serranía del Litoral, the coastal mountain range, heading directly toward two places you now know the names of, La Guaira and Caracas. That segment has been implicated in the Caracas earthquake of 1812, one of the most destructive events in Venezuelan history, and according to that analysis, it has not broken in a great earthquake since. The modeling indicates the June rupture pushed stress toward it. Now hold on, because this is precisely the moment where a channel with worse instincts tells you Caracas is next. It doesn't work like that, and here is the honest version. Coulomb's stress modeling estimates a change in the forces acting on a fault. It doesn't tell you where that fault was in its own cycle to begin with. A fault carrying 2 centuries of strain and a fault that released last decade will respond entirely differently to the same nudge. Stress transfer of this kind is measured in fractions of a bar, tiny compared to the stresses already stored in the rock. It can shift the timing of an eventual rupture. It cannot manufacture one out of nothing, and it produces no date, no decade, and no guarantee. No seismologist on Earth can tell you when that segment will go. What they can tell you is that the segment exists, that it sits beneath a metropolitan area of several million people, that it has been quiet for a very long time, and that the earthquake in June nudged it in the unhelpful direction rather than the helpful one. That is a real thing to watch, and it's a considerably more interesting thing to watch than a made-up story about the whole planet waking up. The planet did what the planet has done for 4.5 billion years. 15 or so magnitude-7s a year, distributed wherever the accounts happen to come due. What changed this summer is that 3 of them came due underneath people. So here's what actually comes next, and what I'll be following. In Venezuela, the aftershock sequence on the San Sebastián system, and whether the pattern of those aftershocks supports or undermines the eastward stress transfer picture. That's the data set that will refine or retire the Caracas segment question, and it accumulates every week. In Colombia, the recovery in Choco, where the epicenter sat in terrain that rescue teams can barely reach. And in Indonesia, the toll on Flores, which stood at 51 on Sunday and which everybody involved expects to rise as crews cut through the landslides into Nazca. Subscribe and turn the bell on, because when the aftershock data from northern Venezuela is published, and when we find out whether that segment beneath Caracas is loading or quieting, that's the update that matters, and it's the one this channel will bring you with the numbers attached instead of the noise. Somewhere on Earth right now, an account is coming due. The only question anybody can honestly answer is, which ones have people living on top of them?